Association. We're based in Berkshire, and we've got around about 6,000 units that we manage and look after. And I think in common with a lot of organisations more recently, and particularly off the back of the white paper, something we've done that I've actually noticed is a bit of a theme across the sector is this, this focus on communities has been incorporated into the change of the director title. So we've just had a new director of resident services and communities at Housing Solutions. But we're not the only organisation that's done that. I've seen a lot of directorate titles change and director titles change across, housing associations up and down the country. So the white paper, I think, has really clearly shone a bit of a spotlight on communities and the connection between housing associations and the communities that we operate in. And Matt and I were kind of, tossing ideas backwards and forwards a couple of weeks ago. And I suppose when it boils down to it, the real question that sort of bubbled to the top as our conversation developed was, well, when we think about communities, what actually is the responsibility of a housing association? How much or how little are we expected to do? Because there aren't any kind of hard and fast rules on how much you should be doing or how little you should be doing. I mean, that there are aspects of resident engagement included in the regulatory standards and so on. But resident engagement's a bit different from actually getting involved in and developing and building and supporting and promoting communities. So that's kind of where the idea came from for this roundtable, because we thought it'd be really, really interesting to see what other people think, what your views are across the sector and people from outside of the sector that have an input into this. So that's the question, communities, whose responsibility are they? So what I'm going to do now, hopefully, is share a PowerPoint slide. So can you all see that? Excellent.
Well, I can hear.
Brilliant. So go on to the next slide. So when we think about community, I think the starting point has to be, well, what does community actually mean? And I don't know if any of you have thought about that at all. I mean, when you think about community, and I want to hear from you, so please, take yourself off mute or stick an emoji hand in the air or put something into the chat. But what do you think community means when you think about, your personal community, the community for the residents that you work with? That there's any number of ways in which you can think about community. But what do you think it means? Has anyone got any thoughts that they want to share? I think there's, there could be many, many different takes on this question. I think I saw a hand. Will's got his hand up.
Yeah, I think that you can split the definition of the word community into sort of two areas. One, you have a community as a sort of collective of people with a common interest. So when we talk about online communities and any hobbies that you might be involved with, you have a community around that. I do a lot of amateur dramatics, and we have the theatre community, that sort of thing. But I think within the context of social housing, community really more refers to the collective feeling of the place where you live. So, for example, if you have a block of flats that might, a high-rise block of flats with about sort of 20 plus units in, then what sort of community do you have in that block of flats? If you live on an estate, what sort of community do you have with what level of interaction do you have with your neighbours, be it a positive one or a negative one? Anything from sort of like a negative community where there could be an estate with a lot of antisocial behaviour to a really positive community. In former life, I managed an estate where they had their own Facebook group set up that you could become a member of if you lived there. They did, off their own back, they did a little community newsletter, and they would do things like get together in the green space on the estate for carol singing over Christmas. yeah, just that sort of collective of people and the collective feeling.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks for that, Will. That's really, really interesting. I think Arthur had his hand in the air. Did you want to say something off the back of that, Arthur?
I think it's just to support what Will said. I think it doesn't necessarily have to be, like you said, like a physical. So community doesn't have to be something, just a house or a street or a park. I think it's that shared sense of belonging. I just put in the chat. I think the challenge for us, certainly as a community-based organisation, around that question, what does it mean, is that it means different things to different people. And it's not really, I think the failure of trying to do community investment work or community engagement work is when you go into it, and us, I guess, as housing associations, go into it and say, this is what we think the community is and this is what the community needs. And that straight away is not understanding what community is, because it's not about what you think it is, it's what people that you're serving, that you're working with, believe it to be.
I think that's a really interesting point, Arthur, and oh, sorry, Matt, go on.
No, I was going to say, Safina's also just added to that by saying it's a sense of place that connects people. I quite liked that as a terminology. Yeah.
But I just wanted to pick up on something that Arthur had said there, because he talked about kind of making these assumptions. If we as housing providers kind of go to engage with our residents from a community aspect, and we assume, well, okay, this community is this street or is this estate or whatever it is, because I think we need to acknowledge, and maybe we're not great at doing this as a sector, but actually, can't you have a community that might cross-cut several different geographical locations? Because you can have, for example, an LGTB community, you can have a BAME community, you can have a youth community that maybe they need to come together. You could have a single mums community that maybe want to get together and support each other. So I think it's really important to make sure that we don't kind of blinker ourselves too much in the view that we take of, well, what is a community? So when I was sort of having to think about this, I sort of put some words together that you might associate with what a community is. So you've got neighbourhood there, which would maybe be a geographical thing, but a union, if you think about it in its sort of most commonly used context, you're thinking about trade unions, which is a workplace community. And we all have a workplace, don't we? And that's our community. But the same might also be said for our residents. They might have particular unions or associations or societies or, hubs or centres or whatever it might be. So I think in that sense, we kind of need to make sure that we think about community in the absolute broadest sense possible, so that we don't do precisely what Arthur was talking about and become too blinkered and make too many assumptions and take that sort of almost sort of parental approach as organisations towards our residents. Okay, so the next question that when I was thinking about communities and I had in my mind, so once you've thought about, well, okay, what is a community? What does it mean? Obviously, communities have a lot of input that goes into them. And if you think about registered providers, housing associations, kind of sitting in the middle of a web of organisations and agencies that might get involved in communities. If anyone's already doing community work, community engagement, community development, and so on, what are the other organisations that you reach out to say, look, do you want to get involved? Do you want to have some participation in this? What kind of groups are people already reaching out to try and help with community building and development? Is anybody doing any work around this at the moment? I don't know if we've got any comments on the chat from people, or if anyone wants to pop the hand in the air and kind of talk a little bit about what your particular organisation is doing. I'm happy to keep talking about housing solutions. But
no. So I can see Arthur's just raised his hand there, so we'll bring him in. But
fantastic! Come on then, Arthur. What's Bourneville Village Trust doing?
Well, and by looks at Sarah Smith, I was going to say, just in terms of the chat, Vicky had mentioned that it's such a broad term, it completely depends on those within the community to define it. So it's our role to respect that and be invited in. And Kerry from Phoenix has mentioned there has to be a work together to find out who your community is. So I think it's really kind of, you're resonating a lot with what people are sharing today. Arthur, do please continue.
No, I think it just builds on what Vicky and Kerry are saying in the chat. We're just about to deliver, or actually we just started the neighbourhood planning project, which is specifically looking at geography at Bourneville and the areas that we service. But it's also going into those communities and working with the residents that are in those geographies, but also looking at all of the stakeholders, so police, health, education, community groups. One of the areas that we've often talked to, and I say talk to loosely, are those smaller groups. So things like mother and toddler groups, older persons groups, faith groups, young youth services. So we're basically speaking to everybody, because the reality is, I think, goes back to the conversation we had before. When we talk about community, it isn't just one group, and it's so it goes over so many different areas of the world that just say, well, we're housing, so we'll go and speak to people we know because we know best, is again something we're trying to move massively away from. But also we're going into it with very open questions. So we're not going into it saying, we know that, so what do you want us to do? We're going in and saying, talk to us about your community and let us kind of holistically work out what it is that collectively we want to do together.
Brilliant. Will, let me add you in, and then we'll get Emily to kind of follow up on that.
Yeah, from an organisational point of view, Eastlight, we are currently the largest community gateway organisation in the east of England, and we are putting a lot of money into community building. We have a whole sort of subsection of the organisation which is leading on what we've termed the All In project. You can find it on Facebook. I mean, I don't think we are entirely clear of where we're going yet. It's still in its infancy stages, but we have the idea is behind building communities that people want to live in effectively, and being tenant-led in this piece of work, but not just tenant-led. We have put in a lot of time and effort to, again, this is an ongoing process that's still sort of in its infancy, but we're putting in a lot of time and effort to go out into the community, to use the term in one of its definitions. We funded an ice cream van that was giving out free ice creams, but the caveat was, in order to get your free ice cream, you had to sit down and have a little chat about what you liked in your local community, and what you would like to see improved within the community. And this wasn't just aimed at Eastlight residents, this was aimed at people in general in areas where we have a lot of stock. So I think the overall idea is this acceptance that in order to build a good community for our residents, we have to look at the wider area and the wider people involved, because the idea of these social housing estates that just have social housing tenants on are a thing of the past. So you need to embrace the wider community, using that word again.
You've got a lot of nods there, Will. Emily, do, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say off the back of that, well, I think that's, and this kind of ties in with what Vicky and Kerry were saying earlier about kind of their understanding, their definition of what community means to them. I think it's really, really important to go out and to talk to residents about what community means to our residents and what they want when it comes to community services. And not just what they want, but also what they need as well, because those are two different things. And that's really important. The reason I think that's so important is that there are lots and lots of examples out there that those organisations that invest more heavily in asking their residents what they want and need, and then responding to the information that the residents give back, routinely have customer satisfaction rates in the highest quartile. And I'm thinking to go to kind of, I want to say the complete extreme of community engagement, but actually I don't think it is that extreme a model. But I'm thinking about there's a model for housing associations called the community mutual model. And if you look at, so two examples of those, Watford Community Housing Association and South Oxford Housing Association, SOHA. SOHA in particular, I mean, they have customer satisfaction levels at kind of regularly between 93 and 95% because of the extent to which they deliberately reach out to their residents and pull those people towards them. And if anybody doesn't know what a community mutual model is, please let me know. I'm more than happy to give you kind of a quick overview. It's a bit like shareholding, basically. But it really gives people, residents, a sense of ownership over their landlord and the input that they're able to have. So Will, I think, you know, that idea, I love that. I hope you did it in the summer with the ice cream van, because doing it in this weather in the winter, I mean, gosh, you literally would have been selling snow to Eskimos.
I think right now people are probably taking ice cream, wouldn't they? I think that'll be the thing. I mean, we've got Vicky and Ruth I'm going to bring in, Emily, but I think the other side with Will as well that I found really interesting was that you're using Facebook, because if there is a community anywhere that's bringing people together, social media is making everything smaller. Vicky, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, we're about to launch a project. It's probably fairly similar to what Arthur was talking about, actually. But we know from how things are, how people feed back to us from our day-to-day interactions in communities where things may not be working in a way that we think they should. That happens. I mean, that's how we operate, and that's how the sector has operated. But one of the things that we're looking at doing is launching a model that was tested in Wolverhampton, actually. I'm from WHG, which is Walsall Housing Group, is going into communities and kind of I'm really looking for social innovation within communities. We can go for the big bang on, we can go for the big changes, but actually I'm really interested in what those seed changes could be in communities and where they're wanted and where they're needed and being commissioned by people who live there. So we're looking at kind of more of a festival approach in mini festivals where we bring really kind of aspirational, like really interesting models that have been launched in different parts of the country or the world, whatever, and bringing those into an organised session where we can learn from each other. And then at the end of those sessions, customers and groups can say, actually, we'd really like to try that. And then we kind of commission those as part of our leverage within those communities to really support those and help them be kick-started. But most importantly, they need to be from the community where that happens. It's not about our ideas. We can kind of put things in front of people and give them some experiences and say this could work, this might not work, but it's up to the communities to commission those changes themselves. And I think it's also really important that we don't just kind of miss the groups and organised very informal groups or structured groups within communities when we do go in or when we're invited into those spaces. And actually, one of the questions I posed at a commission meeting this morning with the local authority is, do we know all of these groups that exist? Do we know all the services that exist within our communities? And actually, we all probably know pieces of the puzzle, but we don't know it collectively. And actually, that could be a really big piece of social innovation that could really help the sector. So there's also things like that we're kind of looking at doing at the moment, but interesting times getting back out there and doing it.
Vicky, that whole piece that you were talking about at the beginning there, of having those kind of taster sessions and those trial runs, if you think about it, that's a bit like the kind of the focus groups that the commercial and the retail sector engages in. And, you know, if I think that innovation about taking ideas from other sectors and using it in social housing in order to improve our services, you know, that focus group approach, that trial run approach, because if you're taking that approach and you're saying to residents, well, okay, you know, here's your options, have a go, tell us what you think, you're really putting the power back into the hands of the residents and to hear their views. But it's also for commercial and retail, it's a really powerful sales technique. And if you think about the commercial and the retail sector, you know, they are all about getting their products out there and seeing them flying off the shelves. Now, our product is housing and all of the add-ons that go with that. But why can't we be interested in trying to make social housing a sought-after product? And this kind of ties back into, and I think community engagement and community development has a big part to play here. But historically, the last, 50, 60 years or so, social housing has for some reason attracted this stigma to it, that, you know, living in social housing for some reason makes you less than. There's this perception. And isn't it the responsibility of housing associations to get rid of that stigma and to uplift our residents and to give them something better and to make where they live the most desirable place for people to want to be? And that's kind of, in a roundabout way, bringing me back to the kind of the wider question of this roundtable, which is, you know, whose responsibility are communities? And just to kind of again link back into the kind of the white paper, which seems to be pushing the responsibility onto housing associations. But do we think big government should also have a responsibility? Do we think local government should have a responsibility? Do we think that we should be reaching out to big government and local government and other organisations, the charity sector and so on, and pulling those people together and having a more cohesive and collaborative approach? And what are people's thoughts on that? And I can see Arthur's got his hand in the air again, but just before
I bring Ruth in, because I know I was going to bring in Ruth before, and then I'll jump over to Arthur. Sorry, Ruth, I'm sorry to keep you waiting there.
Yeah, and just as we go to Ruth, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to put up my little circle of things that I could think about, you know, who could have input into communities. So where we've got Ruth, I think you said, Matt.
Yes, please. Yeah, Ruth Hayward.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't actually work for a housing association. I was just really interested in the topic of conversation. I actually am a chief exec of a local charity, so kind of work very closely with housing associations in the heart of our communities. So it's kind of maybe a slightly different slant on the conversation, but
fantastic.
With regard to who has the input, I think really it's all of our responsibility, you know, to ensure that communities have the best opportunity to be heard. And we're implementing across the county kind of the asset-based community development model and the community builders. And I think, you know, from a kind of charitable perspective, we've really seen the impact that local people can have on their communities and how empowering that can be. So I think it's our responsibility to give space to local people to build their skills, to understand actually not about what their needs are and what they want, but actually what their strengths are, and to be able to give them opportunities and the confidence and empower them to take ownership of their community. So for me, I think it's very much about supporting our communities to influence the way services are shaped, and for us to kind of be that conduit between local communities and the way services are designed. And so I certainly think that central and local government have a huge responsibility in making sure that the policies and strategies that are designed have got voices of people in the communities built into them, but also, you know, some responsibility to have people from our communities within that decision-making process.
I mean, it's brilliant to have another perspective on this conversation about communities, and thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. Be really interested, so because I think you said that you are already working with some housing associations in the locality where your charity is based. What kinds of things, what kind of community work have you been doing with the RPs there?
A range really, and it's very much dependent on which housing association we're working with. We work closely with Platform Housing, obviously it's a large housing association, but also there's a number of much smaller organisations. So I think it's quite bespoke, and it depends on what it is we're trying to tackle, whether it's an issue around antisocial behaviour, for example. But with regards to Platform, there is a real collaborative approach in working with all of those kind of partners that you've mentioned that you've got on the circle there. So yeah, I think very much around empowering local people to have an opportunity to share their voice. So whether that be through an ice cream van or through community events or fates, or actually what we try and do is work collectively together to put on activities that are requested by our communities. And so actually a lot of them, for example, we hosted a really lovely Eid party, and actually what we try and do is utilise those opportunities to engage, consult, to better understand what the challenges are, and actually then have those conversations around empowering them and making sure we've got the skills and resources within our organisations collectively to be able to draw out those skills and really invest in in those individuals, because there's nothing worse is there than offering to do something and actually not having the capacity to be able to see it through. So there's that kind of ongoing relationship building and creating those sustainable tenancies and communities, and almost wanting them to stand alone without us having to go in and keep putting that resource in. So it's making them sustainable in their own rights.
And I think, Ruth, you touched on a really important point there. When we're thinking about communities and whose responsibility are they, isn't that actually our ultimate aim? Whether you're coming from the charity sector or you're coming from the social housing sector, if we're putting these kind of community projects and programs together and we're putting people in touch with each other, is the ideal, and you might disagree with this, which is why I pose it as a question, is the ideal that we're trying to achieve a scenario where actually the residents and the people based in the community take on the responsibility for themselves, so that they then become the promoters and the drivers behind whatever particular group or project or thing that it is that's going on? Is that what we're aiming for? Do people agree with that? Do people have a different view? I mean, do we always want the landlords to continue being involved so that we can perhaps continue to receive the feedback from that community group and then use it to do something different? Or do we want, the kind of the boats to disconnect from the dock, as it were, and float away and be self-sustaining?
There are a couple of points in the chat, and I'm going to bring in Jim, who I'm really glad to kind of see with us, and then Graham Anderson.
Fantastic.
In the chat, we had, so Kerry there mentioned that she works on Salix Home's customer committee, which aims to give the customer a real voice to change standard jargon and make change, which seems to really come in line with what you're saying there in terms of that, I guess, the responsibility they have themselves there. And then Sarah Smith has said that similarly to Arthur and Will, we have had great relationships with partners for many years, but we've recently redesigned our approach to our customers. So alongside our neighbourhood teams who are proactively visiting customers in their homes, they have a new advisory team which has a holistic approach about mental health, well-being, employment and skills, welfare, to provide support to our customers. And then we have a partner liaison role to engage with community groups. So it's enabled our advisory team to get out and about in those settings. I mean, a lot of people here are immediately agreeing with what you're saying there. Arthur said he definitely agrees. Success would be we are there for the communities when they want us, not because they need us. And Vicky said really interesting to catch up, and she'll love the invite. But let me bring in Jim, because I know obviously we've done a couple of these as well. And Jim, we'll look at this from a number of ways. If you don't know Jim, he runs the Community Safety Podcast. So again, might give a different perspective again.
Morning, everyone. Really good round table. This really impressed. I obviously come from a community safety background, been involved in community safety for about 26 years in policing, housing, and now local authority. And I've got to agree with you, Emily, really. I think the problem, sometimes with social housing, I've worked in social housing, is I think sometimes we can do too much for people. And I think your end goal is very much where I'm at. I think we do need to facilitate. I think we do need to, when we're talking about funding and empowering communities, because I think empowerment is a real big word to use within communities. I think that we have to get the right views of the community. And one of the things that I've seen in my career, and I think again it's something me and Matt talk a lot about this around egos. You can sometimes split communities even within communities. And what I've seen in my service is that sometimes you will get sort of very tight-knit groups that think they're running the community. And sometimes it's very difficult then for other members of that community to get involved. So I think that's a big barrier that we've got to break down. But I think your point is absolutely right. I think we've got to look at people becoming self-sufficient and effectively making their own decisions long-term. And we're just there for really guidance and just to kind of help them re-steer the ship maybe sometimes when it goes a little bit off course. That's certainly how I see it.
Jim, I have to say that when you said that line there about communities within communities, it was like the old Churchill nodding dog advert. Everybody was like, just going away.
Well, it's a fact. I mean, I've seen it so many times in my career, Matt. In fact, I'll be as bold to say sometimes I think the wrong people actually are running some of these communities, and this is why we need to empower more people to get that much broader view on a community. Otherwise, what you get is a very narrow-minded approach, and I think that's very dangerous.
Well, that very last point that Jim makes there, that really comes back to, and this is a completely, I mean, you could have a whole other series of roundtables on this, but diversity in whatever we do as social housing providers really is so important to, you know, maintain that open mind and that ability to see potential in all ideas and everything. Jim, you know, that's such an important point that you've just made there, the kind of the equality, diversity and inclusion responsibility that falls on registered providers and housing associations. So thank you for picking up on that.
No, you're welcome. Emily, can I just pick up on just one very quick point as well that you raised earlier about youth related? When I was a police officer, as you all know, we do get a lot of issues around postcodes. You talked about sort of cross sort of communities. When I was a police officer, one of the things we did, and I think, again, it comes back to some points that's already been raised today, is we went out and we actually wanted to find out what our local young people wanted. And what we did is we actually created a DJ and a radio station for them. And we tried, this was in Smethwick in the West Midlands, and we trained a number of young people with funding. And what we found was that we broke down those barriers. We started to get a common purpose with a group of young people coming from different postcodes, also from different nationalities, because they were the first tranche of the asylum seekers that came over to the UK in sort of the early 2000s. And we broke down those barriers. So I think it is achievable. I really do. But you've got to ask young people what they want. And I think then you start to break down some of this cross-border, you know, don't come into my area. If you come into my area, then something's going to happen to you. It is achievable, but it's got to be directed and managed in the right way, I think.
And I think that's some of it where actually you've mentioned there, communities within communities, because young people themselves are a separate community to their parents, and it's breaking all of it down. Graham, thank you for being patient. I'm just going to bring you in, and then Will, I can see you're also waiting.
That's all right. I just want to go back to that point about doing things for communities and where they are, and then doing it for themselves. And it's a real struggle, in all honesty, because if you're not careful, you project your views about what you think a community should look like. And, you know, a little bit of a chocolate box impression of what a good community is. And I think our role is that a lot of the time is to be advocates, maybe, and Jim talked about attracting funding and tackling stigma, those wider issues, maybe more than the detail itself, because a lot of those communities have been told for a long time that they are worth less than other communities have been. And they believe that too, because they've been told repeatedly. And it still happens in housing. I went to a meeting yesterday where we talked about selling social housing as not just people who look like they're from Benefit Street. Well, that's not okay. That's stigmatization from within the housing sector. And I think we've got to be careful that we're not too paternalistic about this stuff and try and fix things for people. However, we can attract funding. We can put resources in. The police talk about broken window syndrome. Actually, you know, once the windows are broken, no one cares about the community. Well, maybe it's the job of housing associations to just fix the windows sometimes, rather than try and fix the other stuff. And my final point is, I read a really interesting article on conservative home, which anyone knows me isn't my natural place to read stuff from. But there's an MP talking about levelling up now, and it's essential that people like housing associations are doing it, because historically conservative thinking was that you allowed churches and charities to do it, but actually they realised that housing associations are good at it. And I thought that was really positive, until I thought, are they just pushing the responsibility onto housing associations? And that's where I started to then struggle and close down my link to conservative home. So,
you sure you don't want some more conservative stuff coming through your Google, Graham? Are you sure?
I'm not sure how Google works, but if I suddenly start getting plagued by articles from conservative home, I'll know I've done something wrong.
It's always good to try and break out of an echo chamber, Graham.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree, Emily.
Really interesting point there from Safina, which was good point, Graham. We spent a lot of time as housing associations doing things for the customer. Our approach now is to do with, not for.
Yeah, that facilitation, I think, is really, really important, rather than you know, kind of hand holding too much. I think that we can be guilty of doing that. And I'm not saying it's easy. Yes, it's incredibly difficult to strike a balance, because, you know, if you're working with one group of people, they might need a bit more help and support than another group of people, and trying to understand kind of where the sweet spot lies with the different groups of people that you're working with. It can be incredibly difficult. That's the nature of human interaction. I mean, personally, I love it, but that doesn't make it any less challenging. But I think Will has been exceptionally patient again. So.
Go on, Will, over to you.
Yeah.
Go on, yeah.
Thank you. Equally, I do keep popping up to have something to say, so I don't mind being patient. It's I could have so many comments on what's been said, just little details here and there. Just picking up on something that Graham said. I remember years ago speaking to a friend of mine who worked for a different housing provider, and God, I can't even remember who they were at the time. They might have even been Genesis, but they'd gone through a bit of an initiative where they'd taken their branding off their signs that went up at on their estates. And I can remember thinking, actually, how much of a kind of groundbreaking idea that was at the time. So you didn't have this, you now have like a new build estate, and you walk through it, and then you get to the social housing element, and it becomes so obvious that you're there, because the providers got this, even the name sign for like some of the blocks and whatnot have the provider's logo stamped on it. Yeah. And just to remove that branding and just have like a clear silver plaque with the signage up, perhaps it takes away some of that this is the social housing kind of stigma that you can have. But so that wasn't the point that I was initially going to make when I put my hand up. I was just going to say some of the initiatives that Eastlight have got planned and we're developing at the moment, we haven't rolled them out yet, but I'm going to be really interested to see how this pans out as part of our all-in communities building project. We're offering 6-month temporary salaried contracts to involved residents in the hope of getting in more than just your sort of stereotypical involved resident, because with the idea that hopefully we'll open this up to a potentially younger audience or group of participants, or potentially those people who have got more professional backgrounds within our resident group who are looking for work, rather than just your kind of, it's so often time is the factor with involved residents in these sort of community building projects. So you often end up with largely retired residents. And I'm not saying that retired residents, that's a bad thing, but you want this diversity. We were talking about a diverse mix of involved residents. And I'd be really interested to see how this does pan out for us. And the second part of our program, we've got we're putting together a resident academy with the idea that this will be a place that our residents can learn skills, but not just everyday skills or qualifications, but sort of things focusing on learning skills that will be valid for them in helping them build their community. So even right down to teaching them how they can effectively raise things with local councillors and their local MPs so that community issues can be addressed. Again, as the caveat is there that this hasn't happened yet, but yeah, I mean, I'm really excited about this, and I think it could potentially go somewhere really good and really help build our communities in a really positive way.
Will, on that point you're just talking about, the Resident Academy, if you need an example or a template of how it could be done, I'd recommend speaking to the head of customer service at Octavia, Louise Alfred, because Octavia has a Resident Academy up and running already, has done for a few years now, and it's incredibly successful. I'll make a note of that, Emily. Thank you. No problem at all.
And there we are. Everyone's always learning something. Arthur, I will bring you in a moment. I just wanted to let, I know Emily's got another slide to kind of go through on the presentation, so I want to let you jump on and then we'll jump back if that's okay. Yeah, sure. So this is, I'm definitely not a death by PowerPoint kind of a person. So this is the last slide. And what this slide... It's been 4 slides. We've just talked a lot around them, so it's not at all on you. Yeah. But that, I mean, and that, the point is to talk and to hear the ideas. But I think what I wanted to draw out with this slide here, and actually, we've kind of already touched on
some of the points that I've talked about here is very often this idea of community and community working, community development and resident engagement and so on. It's very often seen as, oh, well, that's the bolt on to housing services. It's kind of, that's the housing piece, that's where it sits. But actually, if you really think about it, it is something that does cross-cut our organisations completely. So when you think about what we do with our communities in financial terms, you know, if you're going to get a project off the ground, you're going to have to demonstrate that it's going to have value for money, that the cost and the expenditure that's going into the project is it's going to have a tangible outcome that you can demonstrate at the end of it. Hot topic at the moment. Most organisations are looking at what kind of rent increase they're going to do in April. It's a bit controversial this year. Maximum rent increase, I think, can be, it's either 4.1 or 4.2%. Am I kind of trying to keep my finger on the pulse and talking to other people across the sector? It seems like most organisations are going for that maximum rent increase. Frankly, I'm not surprised. We had 4 years between 2016, 2020, where we had a 1% annual rent reduction. Why wouldn't we take the opportunity as a sector to try and claw some of that back and then be able to have more resources to plough back into more resident services? Thinking about development, and again, another hot topic, and people may have seen in the media last year, there was the opening of the Sky Pool in central London, and the fact that only one of the buildings that supports the Sky Pool is actually able to use it, because the other building has got social housing in it and those residents can't use it. So there's that, what I call 21st century poor doors. And I think there were also a couple of high profile cases of estates in Lewisham where gardens had been gated off so that only private paying residents could access them, social housing tenants couldn't. Ghettoisation of urban centres. Notting Hill Genesis has had a lot of criticism for this, selling off its, what some people term its crown jewels, those beautiful Georgian terraces in the middle of Notting Hill, if anybody knows the area. I mean, they are worth millions and millions of pounds just for a single housing unit. And they are selling some of those in order to build more units of social housing, but away from those, you know, very now well-off urban centres that have benefited, that the property prices have risen because of the gentrification. You know, is that right? What can we as housing associations do by that? What is the asset management and the disposal strategy going to be for our organisations? And then you think about actually building communities from an asset management point of view, and about supporting people to stay in their homes. And perhaps I'm thinking more about the kind of the ageing population and people who might have lived in their home for years, if not decades, and they know everybody who lives around them, and those people probably support them. Is it really right that we start farming people out to supported housing and sheltered housing schemes away from all the people that they know, maybe further away from their families that might be supporting them there? Shouldn't we be trying to keep people not just in the homes that they're used to, but the communities that they've built connections with over years and years, and adaptations is a part of that as well. And then coming back to, I think it was Will who talked about the resident academy. So thinking about apprenticeship schemes, you know, you can get residents in as apprentices. There's no rules against that. Volunteer programs. When I was at Shepherd's Bush, we used to get residents in as volunteers, and they came and sat next to our frontline officers, worked in the offices. Befriending initiatives, reaching out to residents, just, you know, a telephone program to make sure that people get human contact week in, week out if they're living alone, particularly in the last 2 years when people have been in lockdown. And then governance, thinking about community engagement from a governance perspective, getting residents on boards so that board members can hear what the views of the people on the ground actually are. Because I actually chair a housing association myself, and I really try and remind myself as often as possible that there's this sort of disconnect between the people that run the association sometimes and the people on the front line and those who use the services that are provided. And you need to maintain that connection as much as possible if the boards are really going to make the right decisions and act in the best interests of the residents, because it always has to revolve around the residents. We talked about equality, diversity and inclusion already. And then Matt also mentioned previously, you know, the importance of social media and Facebook groups as communities as one example. But, you know, we've got Twitter and Instagram and all these kinds of, I only have a Facebook account and a LinkedIn account. I haven't done any of the others because frankly, I don't have time with a toddler running around my feet most of the time. So, but what you can see from that is just the breadth of impact and involvement that actually, when you talk about communities and what it takes to really work with communities and engage with them, you have to draw in people from across your entire organisations and get them involved. And I think we really do need to dispel what I think is this myth that has grown up around communities, that it's just a housing services bolt-on, because I think it's so much more.
Really
Matt, I think I saw a couple of hands in the air.
Yeah, so Marie Jenkins, I'm going to bring in just a second. Kerry had put in the chat there that some people, again, it's a point that comes up on nearly every single roundtable, is this education piece. It's the social housing with cladding, that the customer struggles around that, and it's this disparity, I guess, between the attitude of, I think it was Will mentioned earlier about, oh, that's social housing. So it's the fact that people don't care enough, and stigma and what it actually means. I do think there's a big education piece around there, because I remember, I mean, it was a decade ago this month that I started recruiting in social housing, and someone said, oh, you're recruiting in social housing. My first thought was, well, can I recruit for a tower block? And that was what I knew. I didn't know more than that. And I think it's very, very easy for anyone who works in the sector and fell into it and has worked their way up and through, and the same with the charity sector and others, is because we understand so much about how big it is a sector and what it does, doesn't mean everyone else does. I still speak to family and I speak to others here that I recruit for social housing. They're going, what? How? And they don't realise how big a sector it is. Marie, let me bring you in.
Hi, I was just picking up on something Emily was saying about supporting people to stay in their homes longer. I mean, I volunteer at Longbridge Village Gym, which is over 55s living. And I think, you know, we've got a lot of stock with under occupation that actually people that do forward plan what they want from their early retirement or their later life, whatever, they can benefit so much more from looking at other alternatives in the future. So from a loneliness and mental health perspective, there's so many benefits from looking at those type of models that can help free up additionals. And then it's a community, you know, we're talking about communities. It's a community within a community then.
Yeah, and Marie, I completely take your point. I think, you know, sheltered housing communities, they do have a lot to offer. I'm certainly not saying that we shouldn't be utilising them. We've got some really successful sheltered housing schemes at Housing Solutions. I think the point I was driving at is that, you know, and again, it comes back to putting the resident at the centre of everything that we do. If the resident wants to stay in their home, shouldn't we be trying to support that if it helps to keep that local community strong? But equally, I do take your point, sheltered housing schemes, they do have some really very quite strong and vocal communities, certainly at Housing Solutions.
Yeah, they do.
I think it's also interesting, as you say there, all it takes is losing one resident. We sometimes miss how powerful just one resident voice can be. And so if that person is evicted or does lose their home or whatever, but doesn't get the support they feel they should have got, that passes very quickly. Arthur, let me bring you in.
I just wanted to talk quickly about that point you made around to who kind of is responsible for communities, and your point, Emily, that you made right at the start around how housing associations have changed. So from a Bourneville Village Trust perspective, community used to be housing and community services, and in 2 years ago we changed into the Communities Directorate, of which housing is a part of, but housing and communities are separate service areas with separate heads of service. And what we're trying to do as well is move away from this conversation around tenant services and resident services, because ultimately they're all residents. And picking up on Will's point again, that piece around separating people and having really, really clear defined areas is challenging. And I guess Jim's point as well, because what you do is if you walk into an area and you look at the street and it's the left is social housing and the right is home ownership, you then automatically then say, well, the people on the left obviously need better community development, they need more services, they need more investment, when actually the reality is often in those communities they are probably the most well supported, or the most well they know what they want better than the people on the right hand side, and that can be challenging for an organization. And then finally, on that point around who owns or who's responsible for communities, I think it has to be a collective responsibility, and that's not just amongst housing associations and charities, but statutory agencies like health, police, education, because the risk is if it does just fall to housing associations, and as we see, Notting Hill Genesis prime example, housing associations are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and turning into house builders with social housing elements, is that what happens is if you have big communities, that the community development and the community responsibility sits with those associations, when those associations change their tack, change their direction, or it's just not viable anymore, then that whole piece then disappears, because everybody says, oh, well, that's so-and-so that does that. Well, they're not doing it anymore. Oh, okay, well, then what can we do? And so I think it has to be about us being enablers, but also being the ones that challenge each other too, and challenge the other organisations. Because I know from my previous experience of community safety, people would sit there and say, oh, well, that's the police or that's health, therefore I've done my bit and it's over to you. Well, actually, that's never going to resolve anything. It just, it creates a situation where we find ourselves in where we're recently, where everybody goes, God, whose responsibility is communities? Well, I don't know, who's the landlord?
Yes,
and then nothing happens.
And it's really interesting though, Arthur, that you talk very sort of clearly about sort of involving the residents and involving the tenants. But so here's a question and I love actually the take that Bourneville have kind of the spin you've put on it in terms of making communities a holistic thing by itself, and recognizing that it does really need, if you're going to do it well, it needs that investment from a finance and a human resource perspective. But here's a question. As housing associations, if we're working with our residents and we're working with residents as communities, ought we not to also be reaching out to and drawing in the wider communities that those residents sit in? Yes, our residents have their own communities, but if we're, and this ties back into the stigma that attaches to social housing, actually, isn't there a responsibility there also to seamlessly embed our residents into the communities that they're in, and those communities are more diverse, and it is important that you have kind of private residents cheek by jowl with social housing residents, and nobody should be able to tell the difference. And that point that was made about signage earlier, I thought that was brilliant. So what do people think about to what extent we should be reaching out to those people in the community beyond our residents, the people that live next door, or the people that live on the floor above, or the people that live across the street? I mean, what are views on that?
I'd love to hear some new voices as well. I don't know whether anyone who hasn't jumped in yet would be willing to. It'd be great to hear some, but I'm waiting to see if anybody puts a hand up. Let's see.
I mean, whilst people are thinking about what their view might be, I mean, I do think that if you're, as an association, if you're trying to take on that responsibility of helping to build and support and facilitate communities with your residents, then I don't think you can avoid actually working with people that are not your residents as well. It seems almost impossible not to touch on those people outside of the resident community. But I think Graham's got his hand in the air. So Graham.
I think exactly that. I think if you're genuinely talking about communities, you've got to be completely tenure blind, and you've got to be prepared to spend money on people who aren't your customers. That's the reality. I see a lot of right to buy properties on estates that haven't benefited from external wall insulation, haven't benefited from new windows, bathrooms, kitchens, and those customers can often be really struggling and have not had the same level of investment as our customers have. Equally, you've got to, as an organisation, lobby developers and strategic housing teams to say, please don't go and bung all the social housing on the back of a new estate, integrate them and work hard to make it tenure blind. But the reality is, when money calls the shots, that's what they're going to do. They're going to put social housing in an area where it's seen and hopefully not heard from an ASB perspective. That's what they perceive. But I think it is about all of those things. And if you do, and I like Arthur's view, we've made the same separation at BDHT. If you believe in sustainable communities, you've got to spend money on everyone, not just your own customers.
Yeah, absolutely, Graham. Thank you for that. And I think we've just about got time to squeeze Karen in.
Yeah, my background is local authority, and I would be looking at a lot of regeneration is happening around everywhere, a lot of building, and I'd take it right back to the planning stage. When we're planning these estates and regeneration, etc., what conditions are we putting on developers and organisations to make sure that they've got in place? And it could be that they need to involve the community at the design stage. And I know there is consultation, but as we all know, it's just a letter through the letterbox. It's not actually engaging with the community as to what do you really want and to what really take on board what they want. And look at licensing of shops, look at environmental health, all those departments that are in local authorities, how are we bringing them in with regards to regeneration and designing? And again, a bit of repeating myself, what conditions are we putting on them to involve the community? I don't think it's enough.
Karen, I think you're absolutely right. I think planning and development's got a huge role to play here. Mm-hmm. You know, we've all seen those site plans of kind of, beautiful new build blocks with the private residents with their balconies and the planting, and then you've got the social housing block shoved in the corner next to the dual carriageway.
Yes.
So I think, Sani, go on. I think we've got time for you, Sani, although Matt might tell me otherwise.
No, we're good.
Thank you. I think ultimately social housing should focus on creating good communities for people to live in, making sure they're providing great services for their customers first and foremost. Once they've highlighted all the issues within those areas and they're able to do so, they should be providing opportunities for their local communities to make sure they're benefiting from the economic value of the housing association. Because if the community are deprived of those social economic values, then they can really bring and improve their own community within themselves. But if you bring them up and give them those opportunities to grow economically, that will benefit the local communities and the local surroundings. And of course, social housing have to work with all their partners, such as the police, the local authorities, the social services. They need to work together in conjunction to make sure the community is thriving. But lack of opportunities, more than often than not, cause deprivation within societies and the communities, and the problems just gets left behind because the people within social housing do not know the extent of the problems within those communities. Again, when we look at the statistics of this social housing employees, you'll notice that lack of diversity causes a lot of issues because nobody is seeing those problems within those communities, or lack of care of the issues within those communities because it doesn't affect those people that are working in social housing. I just thought I'd put that point across. Thank you.
No, thank you, Sani. That's absolutely great. And I completely agree with you. Lack of diversity really does result in poorer service levels for the residents. Diversity it's so important in making sure that we think across the full breadth of the residents that we're here to serve. And I know we're butting up against the time limit at the moment, so I just kind of wanted to round off the discussion because as we've been going through, I've just been writing down some of those key words that have been popping up on a kind of a regular basis, the things that really kind of struck a chord with me. And they were words like empowerment, which is what Sani was just describing just then. Ownership was talked about. Someone talked about making sure that we take a tenure blind approach. We talked about communities within communities. I think the buzzword there is micro communities. And we also talked about barriers and how important it is to overcome the barriers that are there, and things like the cliques. Someone talked about cliques being a kind of an internal barrier. And then, yeah, actually, I think that's my list, actually. So tenure blind empowerment, ownership, micro communities, stigma, and barriers. You know, those are kind of the things that we've really talked around and about in connection with communities today. And, you know, I think that's been an absolutely fantastic discussion. And thank you to everybody for logging in and taking part and sharing your views and coming on this journey with us over the last hour, because it's been a really, really wide-ranging conversation. So thank you, everybody, for your participation.
And a massive thank you to Emily. I mean, obviously, you know, we discussed this a few weeks ago, and you've put this together, and you've absolutely led a phenomenal conversation. I'd reach out and I ask my network who I've built and who I reach out to if they'd like to attend. And it was such an important topic. You've been a phenomenal co-host, so thank you so much. I do feel this is a topic we will revisit, because I think there is more and more we can look at within this. And thank you again to everyone for attending today. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing all of you or speaking to you soon. And Chris, good luck with today's Wordle if you haven't done it yet. I meant to grab you at the beginning, but I'll catch you all soon. Take care, everybody.